everyone, I'm Fern. I run the farm operations at Boundless. And today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the first step in growing a garden at your home, which is buying the seeds and the soil. Just a heads up, today's mostly going to be focused on starting seeds indoors, and I'll go over a little bit about why we do that in a second. But if you have any questions about direct seeding into the garden, please throw them into the chat box like Mara said. Okay? Can everyone hear me okay? Thumbs up? Great, awesome. All right, so let's start with why people start seeds indoors. So in the beginning of a plant's life, there are really two ways that that plant can start. You can either start direct seeded into the ground in your garden, or you can start it in a tray like this one here that we have filled with potting soil. And in Colorado, where we're hosting this, we have a wicked short growing season, and it's really hard to actually have the full life cycle of a plant like a tomato or a pepper unless you start them indoors and give them that little head start. So today we're going to go over that process a little bit. So, there are a lot of benefits to starting your own seedlings. One of them that's my favorite is that you can select the varieties of the plants that you really want. Today we're going to talk a little bit about the differences in organic seeds, but it's so beneficial to start your own seeds at home because you get to really pay attention to what nutrients that plant gets. The baby plant is completely dictated by its surrounding environment. So if you want a nutritiously dense plant, you need to have really nutritious soil, really good sunlight, and really adequate water. And so starting your plants inside and picking the specific seeds that will thrive in your climate and will do okay indoors is the first step in that process. Some other really important things, in this current pandemic, starting your own garden at home is really an act of resilience and love for your community. It's cutting out the trips to the grocery store, and it's allowing you to grow the most nutritiously dense food at home, which will hopefully cut down on what you're having to purchase out in the community. So let's go over the first step in starting the seeds. The first step being buying the seeds. So when you're buying organic seeds and plants, there's really three avenues that plants exist in. The first one being hybrids. Those are F1 seeds, and you'll see on a seed packet that it has an F1 on it. Can everyone see that? A little bit? Great, awesome. So we'll start talking about those F1s, those hybrids. F1 seeds are intentionally crossbred by humans. And so humans are doing the pollinating process. The great thing about hybrids is that they're extremely consistent in yields. And that's something that we call hybrid vigor. They do really well because they're bred to do so. And they're often bred for certain traits like disease and mildew resistance. So those are some good things to hybrids. One bad thing about hybrids is that usually only one person owns that lineage of seeds. And so you have to buy them from the sole proprietary owner of the strain. And so for that reason, they can be really exclusive. The other thing about hybrids is that they can't be seed saved every year. And so something at Boundless that we really care about is seed sovereignty and saving those seeds every year so that you can continue to grow that lineage. And hybrid seeds, farmers have to purchase them year after year. So that is one little drawback about them. The other positive thing about hybrids that I will say is since they do have, genetic strains that are built to have higher yields, mildew and disease resistance, they often require fewer inputs like fertilizers and pesticides. And so they're really good for broadacre farmers. For home gardeners though, we would recommend you go a different route. Some common F1 varieties would be early girl tomatoes. That's a classic. Sun gold tomatoes, those are really the candy of the garden. They're super sweet little tomatoes. And premium crop broccoli. So those are some common ones that you'll get in the store, and they're still organic. They're just hand selected and hand pollinated by humans. If you are interested in purchasing hybrid seeds, our favorite seed dealer, if you will, would be Johnny Seeds. And just make sure when you're checking out that you do select the organic seeds. I want to pause. Does anyone have any questions on hybrids? No? I can't see some people, so I'm wondering, is there anything in the chat, Mara? Nope. Great. All right. So let's go on to my favorite variety of seeds then. And those are open pollinated and heirloom seeds. And really for today's purposes, they're essentially the same thing. So open pollinated and heirloom plants, when you're growing a wide variety of them, if you were to purchase a seed packet of them, like these here, they're a lettuce seed, you're gonna get essentially the same plant from all of those seeds, but since they are pollinated naturally by both pollinators and wind and not humans, there is a little bit of genetic variation within them. And some people really see that as a drawback, but I really see that as a strength of them because there's more genetic biodiversity. And usually, you know, it's a really refined system that plants have been practicing for millennium. And so they've really got it down, you know, who survives. And so when you're growing open pollinated and heirloom seeds, typically you're gonna get pretty much the same seed repetitively in that packet. Many home gardeners really like the taste of open pollinated and heirloom seeds, myself included. I just think they're extremely lovely and so delicious. And one other wonderful thing about them is that you can save the seeds from them year after year. So that way you can create a regionally adapted lineage of that seed that is, you know, kind of your family's heirloom seed that you can then pass on. So if you're wanting to go the route of heirlooms and open pollinated seeds, we have a few companies that we really like to source the seeds from here at Boundless, and I can list those out for you now. So the first one would be Baker Creek Heirloom Seeds, and at Boundless, about 99% of the crops that we grow are organic pollinated or heirloom, and we source a lot of our seeds from Baker Creek Heirloom Seeds online. Another great one would be High Mowing Organic Seed. That's who this is a hybrid. This is one of the few hybrids we grow, but this is the Carmen sweet pepper. It's a sweet red pepper that we purchased from High Mowing Organic. And then another wonderful group is Seed Savers Exchange. If you're wanting to go the local route, which we would absolutely advise, there's a wonderful nonprofit in town called Masa Seed Foundation, and they want a cooperative seed bank that's all non-hybridized seeds. And so they work to grow out those strains and then save them year after year to regionally adapt them to the harsh growing climate that is the Front Range. So purchasing your seeds from them, you can actually get them online and fill out an order form, and we would definitely recommend going that route. So their name again is Masa Seed Foundation, M-A-S-A. Has anyone here heard of them? I'm getting a few yeses and a lot of no's. So definitely check them out. They do have a website. And then if you're wanting to grow those heirlooms and those open pollinated varieties, we have a few like common varieties that you may recognize the name of. So one of our favorite heirlooms is the Cherokee Purple Tomato, as well as the Brandywine Tomato. Those are delicious heirloom varieties. The Scarlet Nantes is a carrot that does really, really well along the Front Range here. And then Jimmy Nardellos are a personal favorite of mine. I can't help but plug them. But they're a sweet heirloom Italian frying pepper that's red and it has huge yields. And we grew Jimmy Nardello seeds last year from Masa Seed Foundation in town, and they were just phenomenal. Like I didn't even know what to do, you know, with all of the peppers that we grew. So we would definitely recommend trying out some of those heirloom varieties. Oh, is there a question in the chat? Okay, great. All right, so let's move on to, you know, we've got the seeds pretty much covered. You're gonna wanna go for open pollinated or heirloom varieties purchased from those companies. Is there a question? Okay. One important thing to note when you're buying your seeds, you know, at the beginning when I mentioned there are kind of two ways that you can start the plant's life. The first being you can start them indoors, right? But the second being that you can direct seed them. There are some plants that really don't want to be started indoors. Plants like squash, they really don't like that. Certain radishes and root vegetables don't like to be started indoors because then you disturb the root when you're transplanting them. But plants like tomatoes and peppers, onions, and then certain lettuces really like that little head start. If you are really antsing to get some stuff in the ground right now, some great varieties that you could do would be greens. Greens and carrots thrive in this cooler weather. And so you can start planting those immediately. The important thing to note is when you're shopping for your seeds online or in person, flip over the seed packet. Seed packets should contain most of the information you need to know about planting the seed, and they'll tell you whether you want to direct plant them, direct sow them, or start them indoors and transplant them. The other thing they'll tell you is if they're frost hardy or not. And so most varieties of heirloom greens can tolerate some amount of frost. And so you can plant things like this wonderful spinach, Bloomsdale, it's a classic, mustard greens, let's see what else we have, lettuces, kale. I mean, a ton of greens will thrive right now outdoors if you're to plant them. And so just flip over that seed packet or check online to make sure that your varieties are frost hardy if you're wanting to get them in the soil outdoors right now. All right, so enough about seeds. Let's move on to the soil. Oh, Mara, do you have a question?
I was just going to say, if anyone, does anyone have any, we're posting, so in the chat box right now, I'm providing the links for all the different companies that Fern mentioned. We do not get kickbacks from any of them, I promise you. We're buying at full price, but they're just the ones that she loves and feels like they're all doing what they do with great integrity. So I will post them here in the chat group, and then we will also send an email out with a list of those so that you have them in your inbox as well. And does anyone have any burning questions before we move to soil?
Great.
Okay.
All right, let's move on to soil then. Sorry, the chat box keeps lighting up, but I see it's a thank you, so that's good. All right, so what to look for when buying potting soil. The first step in buying potting soil is avoiding peat. And you may, if you're familiar with gardening, you may be like, but peat is in everything when it comes to potting, and people plant in peat or pots made of peat, you know? But the harvesting process for peat, you know, peat actually grows in a bog. And so when people harvest it, it releases a ton of methane, and it's really, really bad when it comes to climate change, and it's really awful for the communities that surround that peat bog. In fact, there's so much methane in them that the peat bogs themselves will just start on fire. They're very combustible. So it's something that as humans, we probably shouldn't be messing with in mining. The great news is there's a really solid replacement for peat, and that is coconut husk fiber, or it's also known as cocoa core. And so cocoa core is actually a byproduct of the coconut industry. It's already out there, you know, and so it really replaces peat very efficiently. So if you can, look for a potting soil that has cocoa core in it and not peat. So when purchasing potting soil, we have a few favorite brands that we'd like to share with you that we are not getting paid from. So the first one is Fox Farm. Second one is Happy Frog. And then the last one here is the wonderful local Paonia Soil Company. And so Paonia Soil, you may recognize the name Paonia. It's from Colorado, right? These guys do great work. What I have here is the raised bed mix for their soil. But if you're going to be starting your seeds, we would recommend starting them in their product that's called The Bomb. And it's a potting soil that's phenomenal. So slide that 2 cubic foot bag of potting soil over and get it out of my way. So when you're purchasing your potting soil, the brands that I had just mentioned, McGuckin's Hardware in town actually sells all of them, and you can pick them up on a curbside delivery right now. Just be aware that this is what 2 cubic feet looks like. It's pretty big, it's pretty heavy, it's a lot of potting soil, it'll fill a lot of trays. If you're going to avoid the route of going out in public and buying potting soil, the good news is you can make your own, and it's actually really common to do so. Making your own potting soil is simple, super simple. You can coordinate you can specify like what ingredients you really want in there to really make it your favorite mixture, and then you can like pass that recipe on to all your friends. In general, for making a potting soil, it's 1 part nutrients, 1 part moisture, and then 1 part aeration. And so for that nutrient part of the recipe, we like to use a mixture of well-aged compost and a slow-release granular organic fertilizer. You may be like, what the heck did she just say? So let's break it down. Well-aged compost. Everyone here is probably familiar with compost. It's just absolutely nutrient dense and wonderful. Make sure you're not getting like brand new manure or something. That is not compost. Compost is a process that takes a lot of time, and it breaks it down. If you put real like fresh chicken manure, for example, and you try to grow in that, it's what we would call hot. It's too hot. And so that'll actually burn your seedlings and they won't grow. There's just too much nitrogen. It needs to break down with time. If you're wanting to get some compost, I would recommend taking a trip up to Fort Collins and maybe buying bulk. But you can get the Hazeldale mushrooms, which is a local brand. They offer a mushroom compost that's really affordable. And I've heard great things about using that for your nutrient part of your recipe for potting soil. Also, yes, and it's also at Harlequins in Boulder. Thanks, Kira. Harlequins is a great resource if you don't know about it. Literally everything I'm saying is sold at Harlequins Nursery in North Boulder. When it comes to the slow release granular organic fertilizer, which is a mouthful, I would really recommend the brand Dr. Earth fertilizer. You could also use an organic bone meal or kelp meal, and all of those fertilizers are available as well at Harlequin's Garden, and they'll be able to help you out up there picking it out. So in the recipe, that was the nutrient portion. Let's move on to the moisture retention portion. This is where people would typically introduce peat. Remember what I said about peat? It's a no-go. So use the cocoa core here at this point. And so mix in 1/3 of coconut fibers. And then, oh yeah, so the last portion of that recipe is gonna be the aeration. You really want a loamy, aerated potting soil. That air is what brings life to everything. The oxygen is really important. And it also lets the water flow through at an appropriate rate. And so for aeration, we like to use vermiculite. Vermiculite is clay shards that are really thin and stacked on top of each other. And they're really good for both moisture retention and aeration. If you can't find vermiculite, you could go the classic route and use perlite. Perlite is organic rock that it's expanded at a wicked high temperature, and then provides great moisture retention and aeration as well. If you open up a bag of potting soil and you see those little white stones in there that are kind of like chalky, is everyone familiar with what I'm talking about? That's perlite. And so that's really important. And you would want 1/3 of your recipe essentially to be perlite or vermiculite. Okay. And then one other important thing I should note about starting your seeds at home, this is a really common mistake I see, is when people go outside and they get a thing, you know, they fill maybe their seed starting tray with soil from the garden. You can't do that, it won't work. Here in Colorado especially, it won't work. That soil, it just doesn't have the airflow or the nutrients that your seedlings are gonna really want. And it really does not have the water retention that the seedlings need. So we really recommend either buying potting soil or making your own. And the great news is you can usually use it multiple times, you know, if you're being really wise about it. And so whatever potting soil you save from the last year, just heat it up in your oven. And this might sound weird, but you're gonna heat your potting soil up in your oven at 150 degrees, and that'll kill off any of the fungus that could have grown on it over that season. And then you can replant in it that year. Kind of like sterilizes the bad stuff. So just heat your potting soil up. All right, I'm gonna pause. Does anyone have any questions about soil?
Fern, my one question that might be helpful for folks or may not, but just you clearly have strong opinions about what the best way is. And maybe if you could just share 2 sentences about your approach and philosophy around farming and how that has dictated the recommendations you're making. Because lots of people don't garden the way that you're recommending necessarily.
Yes. I try to use the friendliest to the earth methods. And so that's a lot of years of research and then a lot of books and a lot of hands-on experience about what actually works. And so when I'm talking about things like peat moss, Generally, companies are trying to transition away from using peat because we're both running out and it's really damaging and it's really dangerous to harvest because the bogs are on fire. And so the friendlier route to go would be, you know, like the coconut husk fibers, for example. And so anytime I'm mentioning something like that, usually it's coming out of like a background of studying permaculture and then also just having hands-on experience with this.
Okay, we have a few questions in the chat box. So how long do you heat the soil? Jane wants to know.
Great question, Jane. Just throw it in there for, it depends how really thin you do it, but if you spread it out thin, you can put it in there for 10 to 20 minutes and you're great.
And you said at what temperature again?
150.
Okay. And so then Teddy was clarifying, so you heat the potting soil only if you're reusing it, but if you have a bag of unused soil, can you use that without heating it?
Great question, Teddy. So this is the first year that I have owned this bag of potting soil, and so I would not heat it this year. Now, if I had this sit in the garage for 3 years and it was in a humid location and it's not properly ventilated, I mean, there are some holes in this, but there's not a lot of ventilation and there's a lot of moisture in there. That's a perfect environment for fungus to grow. And so if you've had a bag that's been sitting there for 3 years, keep that up because there's this terrible thing that happens with seedlings called dampening off. And dampening off is just the sudden and abrupt death of your seedlings at any point in their life cycle as seedlings. And it's super frequent. And so that happens from usually a fungus growing in your soil, in your fertilizer, or in your trays itself. And so every year I sterilize trays that we reuse with vinegar. And then if there's a bag of potting soil that either has been sitting there for a long time or I used it last year and then put some back in this bag, I go ahead and heat it up.
And then Rona asked if you buy potting soil, is it good to also add compost to it when you're planting your seeds?
Rona, that's a great question. No. If you buy a potting soil, it should come full of all the nutrients your baby seedlings are going to need to thrive. One thing to be aware of is if you're going to leave say you're leaving your tomatoes in their little cells for a really long time, those might eventually need another hit of fertilizer or compost or something. But the goal is if you're planting on the right timeline and you're getting them into the cells and then you're getting them out to transplant into the environment, you won't need to fertilize them in their seedling form again. Question about timeline down there? What does that question say, Mara?
Oh, it says, so how do you organize all the specific time to start seeds and how strict do we need to be? 4 weeks, 6 weeks?
Mm-hmm.
And then, yeah, let's start with that one.
Great question. So there's 2 questions I'm hearing there. What is the timeline? And then do you really have to stick to that? So the timeline varies in importance. I would say you could, tomatoes, you should give them like a good 6 weeks of being a seedling in Colorado before transplanting them outside. And you should only transplant them outside after the danger of frost has passed, which is kind of tricky to tell these days in Colorado. It can really come extremely late in the season. But the most important thing is not planting them earlier than that. You don't want them in their 10 weeks, 8 weeks, because those plants will become root bound. They're more likely to dampen off. They're just going to be like really struggling in that tiny little cell. They want the space to really like branch out. And so you can plant them shorter. You could have a tomato going for 4 weeks and then transplant it out. It's good that you gave it that head start, but you really wouldn't plant, like longer than the timeline says. Does that make sense? And if you're curious about the specific timelines for various plants, the seed packets will usually say.
And usually the last chance of frost is around Mother's Day, right, in Colorado, but we did have snow May 23rd last year. So it is hard to predict. So any words on that?
So many words on that. I would use the end of May as your point to kind of backtrack from week-wise. If you want to be really safe, I would say June 1st. You're not going to get the yields that you would expect, but it's less likely that you're gonna put that baby tomato that you've been growing for 6 precious weeks outside and come outside and see that frost has touched it. There's also this other thing going on in Boulder these days, which is hail, and a lot of it. And so really important thing that we'll talk about during the hardening off and thinning class is the process of covering up your plants after you transplant them. Getting like a hail cover or something on them to just kind of protect them against the hail.
So it is miraculously 1:29, and I know we haven't covered everything, have we? Okay, so we can stay for a few more minutes and answer more questions. There is a question from Tammy, but also feel free to drop off if you need to drop off, and this whole recording will be available online and we'll send you a link to that. If you are direct seeding, will you still use potting soil?
A great question, Tammy. No, what you would use if you're direct seeding is amendments. And so if you're direct seeding like an existing garden bed or a pot that you have on your patio, the good rule of thumb is to add 2 inches of compost every year to that to continue the fertility of that soil. And one really easy thing to tell, like what you're gonna need to amend that soil with when you're direct planting or transplanting, is getting a soil test. You know, it costs like up to $35 to get one from CSU. It's super fast and they'll tell you what your soil needs. If it needs more nitrogen, if it needs more calcium, if there happens to be lead in your soil. So those are all really good things for home gardeners to know. And it's really fun to go through the results, especially if you have kiddos, to get them involved on the science of it. But you're gonna wanna amend your soil every year no matter what. Even if you look at it and you say, wow, my garden soil looks lovely this year. It's such a dark color. It looks really, you know, full of life and moisture. That doesn't mean it's gonna be acting that way or feeding your plants that way. And so getting those 2 inches of compost on there and then any other additional amendments the soil test may tell you you need is really, really important. Sorry, how do you answer?
Rhoda, do you just want to ask your question?
Sorry, just I missed what you said about how you analyze it, where you send it to.
Great question, Rona. You'll send it to your local extension office. Typically, they will run soil tests, and if they don't, you can look online. They'll tell you where they would recommend for you to get your soil tested. You just take a little jar of soil, and it has all the ingredients, and you send it off to the lab, and then you get your result back within a couple weeks usually.
And I just posted for everyone in Colorado, the one for CSU is in the chat box, the link for that. Rona, yours would be different. So you'd have to figure out California.
Yeah, and I just want to emphasize how important it is to not skip the step of amending your soil, especially if you're direct seeding, because the nutrition and the good taste, the sugars of your plant are directly influenced by the amount of nutrition and good stuff in the soil. And so if you want to become you know, the world's best gardener with the best tasting vegetables, the soil is what does that for you. And so really paying attention to the soil and making sure it's nutrient dense and has all the minerals you need, that's what's gonna fuel your food, and eventually that's what's gonna fuel you.
Are there other pressing questions right now? It looks like we do have one. And then maybe before you answer that, Fern, will you just give a quick explanation for what we'll talk about on Friday in case people want to tune back in?
Great, yeah. So what we're going to talk about this Friday is going to be planting your seeds and watering them. We'll briefly go over planting them indoors in trays like this. We'll also go over direct seeding them and the proper methods for doing that, because there's a lot of miseducation out there. And then we'll also go over the watering requirements, and those watering requirements are going to be Colorado specific. So it's going to be specific to our arid climate here.
And then Teddy had a question about, she's an evergreen. How does that change what you've said?
Your growing season's even shorter. I don't think you have the same hail that we have here in Boulder, but your growing season is going to be a little bit shorter. If you look online, you can get the specific last frost date is what they call it for your area code. Take that with a grain of salt because frost dates are shifting quite a bit these days.
Okay, I have a
This-
greenhouse. Should I go ahead and start seeding?
What was that?
I have a greenhouse, so should I go ahead and start seeding?
Start seeding. Yep.
Thank
Yep.
you.
Seed your flowers that you want, seed your nightshades, and then go ahead and seed some kale, lettuce, all those things. Just stay away from seeding squash and seeding root vegetables.
Jane has a great question that you will enjoy, which is, what is your favorite gardening reference book?
Let's look here because I have some of them. Okay, so I think for the joys of gardening and for the joys of the outdoor and like the spiritual aspect of it, Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. That's not a gardening advice book. That's going to be about enjoying those benefits of your garden that go beyond the yields that you're going to receive. For advice though, Practical Permaculture is actually a really good thick handbook that's going to give you a lot of the steps about not only how to establish a garden at your home, but then how to harvest from it, what to plant, like all that good stuff. So Practical Permaculture.
Any other questions before we let you go?
Good, awesome. All right, well, please tune back in on Friday because it's really going to continue this conversation, and you might feel a little confused right now, but we're going to answer those, loose ends in the coming days.